I am surprised it has taken me this long to get to talking about fantasy weapons because they're one of the most exciting topics in the genre, but better late than never. So, fantasy weapons are one of the defining parts of the stories that they're a part of. Excalibur, lightsabers, Galmaraz, these are some of the primary things we think about when we imagine the media that they come from. The things we wish we could wield against the forces of darkness. Few things serve better as the symbol of a piece of media. As for what specifically we're going to be talking about today, we're going to divide this video up a little differently and build from the foundations, starting with Part 1, Weapon Types and their Implementations. So we're going to start with the core types of weapons you might see in a magical world and what they would be used for in a historical context, so that you can either cleave to that for authenticity or, as I always love to say, knowingly pull away from that. Doing this will allow you to make decisions about our further categories regarding uses against different types of enemies or using enchantments from a more informed position. Since if you're watching this video, I'm sure you'll know what all these weapons are, this will be relatively quick and mostly focus on the use cases of these weapon types and who might be wielding them in a more real-life context. So to start, swords, because why wouldn't we start with swords? Now, obviously, as with any of these, everything I say in this category is to be taken with the word generally before it, because basically nothing in history was ever true 100% of the time, and the same will go for your writing, but swords in most cultures were not the weapons of mass foot soldiers. Though we often think of the sword and shield as being the default medieval weapon set, it might have been one of the most uncommon of them all in reality. Swords, especially swords meant for war, were very expensive to make, especially relative to the increase in performance you got for them relative to other weapons. They're harder to use and rely on precise edge alignment to do most of their damage, as they don't have the same concentration of force something like a club or an axe does, where a bit of an off angle can still result in devastating damage. Yes, they can stab, but a spear can do that too, and it requires a lot less metal and can do it at a longer range. I mean, think about it from a medieval commander's point of view. Do you want to spend twice as much time and money training your men to use weapons that might be marginally better when cheaper and easier to use weapons would do just as well? Probably not. Now, one-handed swords would have still been used as sidearms by knights and officers and the like, but it would be very rare for them to be primary weapons. The game changes a bit with two-handed swords, however, which, guess what? Still would have been the domain of more professional soldiers. Also, this is probably why across cultures the sword is a hero's weapon. It's harder to use than other weapons, so only professional and thus generally better soldiers use them, and thus the types of soldiers legends get made about are more likely to use swords, but I digress. They also do just look cool. With two-handed swords, be it the Nodachi you'd see in medieval Japan, the Zweihander of the Holy Roman Empire's Landsknecht, or long swords across medieval Europe generally, these were the weapons of, if not always noble, at the very least career soldiers. Some, like the Zweihander, were nearly polearms, the sort of thing you just couldn't carry with you into town, whereas long swords might be carried around in settlements, should one be ambushed by any foul ne'er-do-wells. Still, the point is if you want a battlefield sword, it was going to be two-handed, and it was going to be wielded by the cream of the crop. Next we move on to the spear, which is one of two candidates for the king of all weapons. Other than the humble club and the knife, it's one of the earliest armaments humanity ever made, because surprisingly, it didn't take us all that long to devise that a pointy stick, or even a stick with a pointier material on the end of it, would make for a pretty deadly implement. Spears are easy for this section because in any pre-gunpowder battle ever fought, you can probably assume that at least half of all the foot soldiers were wielding some sort of spear, and probably a lot of the cavalry too. I've already said it, but they cost almost nothing to make. Even when compared to something like an axe, there's relatively little metalworking needed to make these, and the training is basically as simple as keep the sharp end pointed towards the enemy and don't let them get close to you, which for the purposes of getting an illiterate farmer to become a half-useful soldier in a span of days or weeks is pretty good. For the sake of time, we'll move right along to the axe, which I'll call the Queen of Weapons. It's one of the other types of weapons almost any pre-modern person would already know how to use, or maybe already have. They're simple and easy to use, and while they can cut just like a sword, the weight in the head means that a bit less precision won't hurt its deadliness quite as much. If you want soldiers armed with shields and a one-handed weapon, but aren't feeling having everyone carrying spears, axes are a great way to go because they too are economical and useful. They also have tons and tons of variants, and you can stick just about anything onto them. My favorite variant, however, has got to be the bardiche because the shape is gorgeous, and because who cares about what part of the blade you hit them with if half the weapon is blade? Not to mention the whole Streltsy resting their muskets on them to shoot things, which was pretty sick. However, it was when somebody had the bright idea to marry the king and queen of weapons that they made the halberd and the poleaxe, which are just axe spears. These completely broke the medieval meta and would have been the best weapons for the rest of history had they not gotten serious about that whole gunpowder thing. People talk about polearm supremacy, and the poleaxe and halberd are exactly why. They have all the length and thrusting potential of the spear, but the hooking and chopping potential of an axe. Depending on what you've got in the rear, they even can have a hammerhead or a spike, depending on how you wanted to dress for the occasion. What's not to like? And as far as who got those kinds of polearms, well, basically everyone did. Even knights by the early Renaissance decided that the common troops with their polearms were onto something and took up halberds and poleaxes because they were just that good. Our last main category of melee weapons are what I'll call the bludgeons. This covers clubs, maces, warhammers, and anything that does its damage by crushing and beating rather than piercing and cutting. While they come in many shapes and sizes, there are just a few things to note about them that are good to keep in mind for the sake of your world building. They are heavy and tiring to use as a rule, and that was true for the real ones that looked like this. Not like this, for one, though I do think the fantasy ones that are huge are still pretty cool. They were also a lot more difficult to use than you might expect because the small striking area meant it was kind of easy to just miss entirely, or strike on the haft of the weapon and thus not actually deliver much force into your target. With that in mind, it kind of sounds like these weapons would suck until you realize what sucks more is getting hit with one of them, even when you're wearing plate armor, and then their existence makes a lot more sense. Before we move out of melee weapons, honorable mention to war picks, which had the stabbing potential of spears and the form factor of an axe, though they were usually just the other end of a warhammer, and the dagger, which aside from the obvious, was also a backup weapon knights would use to brutally wrestle with one another until they could jam it into joints and eye sockets. But then came the ranged weapons, which really started with slings, which are actually quite underrated. I don't know enough about them to tell you much other than apparently it really sucked to get hit in the face with a rock going that fast. Who'd have thought? As for bows, they were a lifelong dedication for many archers of the pre-modern world, to the point that, and I'm slightly worried this is apocryphal information, but I'm pretty sure it's true, we actually have evidence that the skeletons of lifelong archers were actually visually different from those who didn't shoot bows because of the type of strains it would put on your body. And there's a reason people were willing to take those strains. Bows were really good. You can shoot them fast, accurately, and they're very powerful. I'd argue a skilled lifelong archer probably would have more firepower than someone armed with the average service rifle of any given modern military up until maybe the late 19th century's standard firearms came about. At which point the range difference becomes just too severe in the rate of fire and yada yada yada. So thus it begs one of my favorite historical questions. Why was the bow ever replaced when it was so thoroughly one of humanity's greatest inventions? Why did the crossbow ever need to exist? And that's because the crossbow was just way easier to use. You could train anyone to use a crossbow. Just pull it back, point and shoot, and it was almost as powerful. What you lost in rate of fire, and in some cases accuracy, you'd make up for with just the sheer number of people you could give one and have use it competently. And muskets, which would seem even worse because they are even slower to load and more expensive to actually make, were even, further down that end of the scale, but now you don't need any strength to operate them really, other than to hold it. And yet they took over the battlefield because morale impact of being shot at was a new thing, and they were just extremely easy to teach people to use. So now I've had my opportunity to ramble at you about all sorts of historical weapons. But as with all of these things that we world build and write about, they all need to have a context to exist in. and sometimes that context can get a little difficult to keep track of. But that's where today's sponsor, World Anvil, can help you out. JBat here to talk to you about World Anvil once again, because World Anvil's pretty cool, and so are the people that run it, I know now. But as we all know, writing is complicated, world building is complicated, and that's especially true when you're working with genres like sci-fi, fantasy, really anything in the speculative fiction world is pretty complex. Keeping all of that information organized is a nightmare. But World Anvil has got your back. If you need templates to keep track of character information, World Anvil's got it. If you need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of every location, World Anvil can do that. If you need a template for a magic system, World Anvil can also do that thing too. World Anvil can even help you with the very nebulous and complex topic of the timeline, which, considering that some of us like to do multi-thousand-year timelines, is pretty good. All put together, World Anvil is great for giving you that wiki vibe where all of your world building is part of one solid ecosystem. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any annual membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. Use code JBAT for 51% off a yearly membership. Thank you to World Anvil for sponsoring this video, and thank you for not skipping the ad. But with our rambling about historical weapons out of the way, we can move on to part 2, using them against fantasy creatures. Now that we've established what all these weapons do, we can establish a baseline for what might be a good way for you to have characters deal with certain situations in ways that make sense. Because trust me, there are many of us who might just lose our last bit of sanity if we see another piece of media where a completely bog-standard sword cuts through plate armor as if it were made of paper again. So take, for example, the idea of fighting a stone golem. What would you do about that? What would you use? You wouldn't use a sword because a sword isn't going to cut through stone. You would use a mace because a mace might break the brittle stone. You see where we're going with this? But then you fight an ooze, you fight a slime, you fight something that's squishy and jiggly, and I'm starting to not like these adjectives all that much. But then you might swap weapons. You might use the sword because if you cut it up enough times, it might stop moving, whereas if you just jiggle it with the mace enough times, it may not do anything. Got to think about it that way. Now, as with any of these situations, it'll be context dependent. Maybe your creatures won't work quite the same. Maybe the properties of your stone golem make it so brittle that even a sword can break it, or so tough that even the mace can't crack it. But this is the general logic that we're talking about. Back in history, each of these weapon types meant something, and were used for different purposes for different reasons. And if you, as the writer, use those differences intelligently, I think it's going to reflect well on you, aid immersion, and make your world feel that much more real. And I'll put it this way. This is all dependent on the tone of your story. If you're writing something that doesn't take itself all that seriously and you're just here to listen to me talk about fantasy weapons, then that's cool and I respect that. You don't have to worry about these things all that much. But these are the kind of details that I think can help you a lot if you want that bit of realism or authenticity to add to the feeling of your story. Anyway, back onto the point of this section, don't think of the weapons your characters are equipped with as just being an attack button or a damage value, whether it's an axe or a bow or a musket or whatever it is. Think of the actual properties of that weapon, how it works, what it'd be useful against, and all that sort of thing. Take fighting skeletons, for example. I bet a musket would be really interesting to write about in regards to using them against skeletons, because the projectile is so small it'd probably be fairly hard to hit anything, but if you hit, say, the sternum or the skull, it might shatter it and completely destroy it. Then, of course, the social implications of weapons are always fun and not thought about enough. If you've got a commoner wielding a longsword, people might talk about how they aren't worthy of a noble's weapon. A prince wielding a spear, meanwhile, might get made fun of for using a peasant's weapon. These are built-in historical dynamics that people just don't think about enough, but they're right there waiting to enhance your story, and all you have to do is scoop them up and use them. But beyond that, we can talk about the other side of fantasying then that we do think about a lot more, which is Enchantments and Magic, Part 3. We'll be having to speak a little broadly here because discussing every possible magic substance or enchantment in one section of a video is just not within the realm of possibility, but we'll cover the main things one might expect to see and some common tropes here. We'll start with substances because those tend to vary a little bit less, and that's because there are, I'd say, 3 pillars of magical substances: rarity, durability, mass. I'm sure there are more, but these are the ones I see the most. Rarity is the one that's the most given, as magical substances generally are made necessary to any given plot by being better than any other conventional materials. And if they're going to be better, they should probably be more expensive. And if they're going to be more expensive, it's in part going to make them rarer, or it'll be because they're rarer. Whatever the reason may be, its reasoning is to make the substance that the magical weapon is made of, whether it's mithril, gromril, adamantium, unobtainium, or whatever, more special. However, they might, though this is not a given, might also be rare because they've only more recently been synthesized, or it's just a harder material to work with. Steel was the real world's mithril for a time, as when it was first being developed, it too was harder to make than iron and a lot newer a process to create than bronze. Then it eventually became common enough in use that literally everything is made of it now, so its rarity was lost. Thinking of steel as rare nowadays would be absurd. So maybe including a formerly rare magical substance in a setting could be interesting. After that comes durability, though, which is mostly worth mentioning as a factor that is obvious but not as often thought of. To take a really silly example, diamond equipment in Minecraft wouldn't be very good because diamonds are brittle. So no matter how hard diamonds are, it'd chip and shatter before you get the opportunity to do much of use with it. So when making your world's equivalent to your diamond sword or whatever, make sure you're keeping in mind all aspects of durability. My own super duper special substance, Crythier, with the most creative name ever I know, has the appearance of a crystal but with a more metallic consistency, so it can actually be forged and keep an edge. That sort of thinking, even if it's just a little line to clarify things like that, can help with that all-powerful immersion. Then, of course, is mass. Mass is less obvious as a thing to even think about because there isn't a clear direction here. And which way you go is going to lend better to different weapon types. An extremely light magical substance might not be that efficient in making, say, a mace, because you need to use a lot of it to make it as heavy as needed to do proper damage. But maybe it'd be great for a thin dueling sword. A heavier substance might be suited to an axe, meanwhile. In either case, it's worth thinking about the physical or even magical strain imparted upon the wielder of such weapons, because fighting for your life is, surprise, surprise, tiring business. But then we move on to enchantments, which are so broad that there's once again no way I can cover everything, so I just want to discuss a couple common stars of this angle. Fire swords, to start with, are for whatever reason probably the single most common enchanted weapon. I mean, they are kind of cool, but very overrepresented. However, while they could cut someone and also set them on fire, I guess, they just as well might cauterize any wound they inflict, which, while it would suck, yes, would mean, rather bleakly, losing the advantage of hoping your enemy bleeds to death. Then there's nothing really wrong with sharpness enchantments, they're just a little unexciting. Oh, you turned your magic bill hook into a lightsaber, that's cool and all, but like, I think the problem with sharpness enchantments is that they're a less interesting explanation than the expert work of a master swordsmith or the fine-tuning of an extraordinarily rare substance. Still nothing wrong with an explicit sharpness enchantment, but there are better ways to get that effect, I think. So you might say, all right, J-Bat, if you're gonna kill my hopes and dreams of an enchanted diamond sword, what would you take, huh? And I'm glad you asked, fictional viewer, because in my mind there are two really good and very simple enchantments. One we see all the time and one we don't. The one we see a lot is durability. If you have a valuable weapon and it's magic, it's probably worth ensuring that with magic as well by making sure it won't break. Seems simple enough, and in practical effect it's probably as good as a sharpness enchantment, because if it simply maintains the blade where it is, it'll stay sharp. Simple as. But the other one would basically be a grease enchantment. That's where I'm cooking. And that's because one of the worst things that could happen to you in a melee fight against multiple opponents, other than dying, is to get your weapon stuck in something. The dirt, a shield, the enemy, whatever it is. If your super special weapon gets lodged in something and you can't yank it out in time, you're screwed. Enchant against that. It's not exciting, but if you're really in that kind of world, having a grease thing to just whip your weapon out of whatever it would have gotten stuck in and keep fighting would be an absolute lifesaver. Anyway, those are my thoughts on fantasy weapons, though I'm sure there's plenty more to say for future videos. But with all that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you have any thoughts of your own about fantasy weapons, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sani, and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our loyal squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.